And whether philosophy is the right discipline to look at this problem or not is unimportant to me, because in looking at it myself, I've been guided more by the problem than by the discipline that I started out working in. I mean, when I look at a college curriculum and see how it's divided, and we've got curriculum committees that redivide them like once a week or once a month, and then once a year I mean, I don't give a damn what studies this or who talks about it, but that it's part of the ongoing conversation of our species about itself. You know, who we are seems to me to be very important, even if it's taught in the curriculum under the heading basket weaving. It's an utterly, crucially important topic in my view. The self under siege, this is comes about, I think, in part, the sort of apocalyptic tone to the lectures comes about in part because I really do believe that new factors, new social factors and others in the late 20th century have led to a kind of pressure on human beings, on selves, not as individuals, but on them anonymously. In fact, the systems I have in mind are anonymous systems. And I'd like to characterize a few of those, and as I do so, what I'll be running through what I might call some of the pathologies of the 20th century, and see if there's any way that a conversation rooted in philosophy, in some sense at least, could help us find our way about in it. The most obvious one in the late 20th century, and I thought about this in the hotel room this morning as I saw the arteries of the Beltway running like human blood through a body into the city. And then I also thought about the following thing. I think I mentioned at the end of my last lecture on Nietzsche when I was discussing the postmodern condition, and that's what I would call the information overload. And I'll try to make this come alive with an example from a different culture. Let's take being a Tonkawa Indian in West Texas. They weren't a very well-known tribe, but they are from my home area, so I'll mention them. The Tonkawa Indians' reservoirs for meaning, the best cultural anthropology work we have, were rich, but a limited array of roles, stations, things to be, and so on. But they were rich and holistic. In other words, in that sense, there was an array of things you could choose to be. There were a wide array you could choose not to be, like chief. You didn't exactly choose to be that. But among this array, the decision paths were relatively simple. And the information load you received in, the load of information, the number of images and so on that you saw, the number of things that actually touched your skin, impinged upon your perceptual apparatus and stuff, is quite limited. Compare that situation to the 19th century, and already we have human beings under considerably more pressure, because from the late 19th and into the early 20th century, many things come about that we don't think about philosophically, but which shape our reflection not only in philosophy but in everyday life. I mean, we walk into a B. Dalton's as though there were always cheap paperbacks available to everyone. But that's actually a quite recent development in the history of the world. We fill our universities with them as though they're some ancient treasure and television is some degraded form of the present. And of course that's idiocy. Those cheap books have only been around very recently in the history of thinking. Television now has been around for about, almost a third of that same time. So the point I'm driving at here is the incredible increase in information, the amount and the tons of information. This city itself, and I think I've said this before too, this city itself, Washington, D.C., is a good example. I think if you took all the information collected in the history of the world between the dawn of humanity, earlier than the Dead Sea Scrolls, back when oh, I don't know, hell, maybe Steven Spielberg did it in Jurassic Park, back when dinosaurs put their tails in the mud and whatever. All the marks, sensible marks left by beings of whatever kind. I'm almost certain that in the last 8 years in Washington, there's more information piled in 4 buildings than the whole previous informational load of the history of the human species. To give you an example that may be more immediate, think of the JFK assassination. Is our problem there lack of complexity? Lack of information? No. No, we know too damn much about it. Way too much. There are too many possible assassins, too many secret plots, too many movies, too many books. And under this kind of complexity, the self finds itself in a position where the array of choices of what to believe or not to believe become bewildering, utterly bewildering. Now, this is about events like, you know, the assassination and so on. But, you know, the more important beliefs or beliefs about ourselves become equally bewildering. In the earlier phase of capitalism in the 18th and 19th century, the average worker would change jobs in a lifetime, and I think this went on through the 40s and 50s. You'd change jobs once, maybe twice a lifetime. Now, people change jobs 7 or 8 times in a lifetime. What I'm pointing to here is that the self must find meaning now, however it finds it, in a system in which it just seems to me objectively true that the complexity level has reached a point at which nobody, and this is not Cartesian doubt, you know, this isn't doubt brought on by an evil genie who makes me wrong to my clear mind. No, we doubt in a different way now. We doubt that we could know enough about the big picture to even make sense. I mean, that's why, you know, one of the battle cries of these lectures will be to just make sense, because that will be very difficult to do. Because we'll be doing it in a situation in which there's way too much to make sense about, and in a situation in which the complexity of the systems within which we try to make sense are way, way too complicated. Even our purest motives get caught up in these systems. I'll give you an example. And I don't mean to have every environmentalist in the world burn my tapes, but let me give you an example of system complexity. Suppose America got behind recycling massively, and we began to recycle and become a very efficient society. We'd all be proud of each other. And I mean, you know, nobody like debates environmentalism anymore, right? Even McDonald's is an environmentalist now. I mean, for God's sakes, McDonald's goes, you know. I mean, they're even for Martin Luther King now. I wish they were there a few years ago, but anyway, that's another point. Not a happy one. But no, suppose we became that environmentally conscious. Well, we'd all feel good. Our society would be cleaner. What would be the outcome in the third world where the only things they have to sell us are cheap labor and things that we can't ruin in this country? I don't think it's a long causal argument to see that an American Renaissance and environment would be utterly disastrous for countries in the third world who have nothing to sell us but poisonous gunk. I mean, this is the bad news. This is, in a way, the disappointing thing about even contemporary political attempts to make sense of the self. I mean, we hear politicians say, oh, well, there's no conflict between the environment and the economy. And we go, yeah, I guess there doesn't have to be. But to the extent that we give it thought at all, it's not within the context of these large, massively complex systems, about which, believe me, Bill Clinton, I think, clearly doesn't know any more than anyone in this room. In fact, I think the judgment of the American people is he knows far less about most of these. And this certainly isn't the time to make a didactic political argument to bring in the last bunch of hacks who also couldn't deal with complexity. Because the self under siege, part of what it's about is the complexity of meaning.